This podcast is brought to you by Audible, the world's leading source of audiobooks. If you would like to support it, go to audibletrial.com/Sam Harris. Welcome to the Waking Up Podcast. This is Sam Harris. Okay, well, I'm going to do a Ask Me Anything podcast this time around. Now, as some of you know, I often set out to do these and then answer one question for 20 minutes or more and don't get very far. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen this time around. I'll answer a few questions in a rather long-winded way and then hopefully do some rapid-fire answers and get through many of your questions. I must say, I really appreciate the response I get whenever I go out for questions. I get hundreds. Honestly, I can't even read all of your questions, but I've read many of them, and I just, it's very hard to choose. I'll just work through them, but I also have to do a little housekeeping in this podcast, so I will start with that. First, I'm recording this podcast on New Year's Day, so Happy New Year, everyone. And I ended the year in contentious fashion on Twitter. I don't know why I use Twitter. If I treated Twitter the way I treat Facebook, I would never have any of these entanglements that I so often discuss with you. I would never notice what was being said about me or what sort of skirmishes I was being dragged into. And therefore I'd never be tempted to respond. So it's perhaps deserves some rethinking whether it's worth my paying attention. But as I'll tell you in a moment, at least two of my upcoming guests are coming on the podcast simply because of some Twitter incident. And so that's it's certainly interesting. It keeps me forever uncertain whether I should be using this technology. But in any case, as for my upcoming guests, I have actually three of the guests coming up entirely as a result of Twitter. So you could figure out whether it's a blessing or a curse at this point. I'll soon be speaking with Jocko Willink, the Navy SEAL who was recently interviewed on Tim Ferriss's podcast first and then Joe Rogan's. And I encourage you to listen to both those interviews. That's literally 5 hours of interview with Jocko. He is just a fascinating guy, and I certainly would have always loved to have him on my podcast. And it occurred to me to reach out to him, except, I just heard literally 5 hours of him on two of my friends' podcasts, and it just seemed I wasn't quite sure what there would be to add to that conversation. And Jocko now has his own podcast. At Joe Rogan's insistence, he started a podcast immediately and is banging those out, and the guy is great. But on Twitter, we got thrown together and people were encouraging him to come on my podcast, and he said he'd be happy to do it. And so here we are. So I'll be speaking to him in the coming weeks, and I look forward to that. And I'll try to find a fundamentally new line through the conversation so that we can get to some of his insight and experience that he didn't have a chance to share with Tim and Joe, and that should be fun. I'll also be speaking with Scotty Reitz, who's a former SWAT operator. He was the lead weapons and tactics instructor for LAPD SWAT and now trains people in the use of firearms. And I'm going to talk to Scotty about violence and self-defense and firearms and gun control, and also what it's like to be a cop and the misuses of force that we've all seen of late from cops, and just to get into all of those politically sensitive but interesting areas. And Scotty, I think, will be a great person to do it with. Jocko and Scotty will come close together, and that will be, we can call that Violence Week on the Waking Up podcast. I'll also be speaking with Maryam Namazi, the ex-Muslim reformer based in the UK, who many of you probably know. You've probably seen video of her. I've circulated video of her before. And this was also Twitter-born. There was an incident of what I considered friendly fire, where she went after me for what I think is a misunderstanding of my views on profiling. And, I've always thought Mariam was great, but she more or less slammed me as a bigot, as far as I could tell on Twitter. And so I reached out to her, and she's agreed to come on the podcast, and we'll try to rectify that situation. Whether or not we succeed, Mariam's is a voice you all should hear, and I will bring her to you. There was also another Twitter-born collision, not so friendly fire, with someone who I'd never heard of, a young Muslim, probably soon-to-be lawyer. He's getting his JD at Yale. He's a writer who wrote a truly withering book review in Salon about my book with Majid. And he hated the book, seems to hate Majid, but especially hates me. And hatred really isn't too strong a word. People were hurling this review at me on Twitter. As you know, I don't tend to read Salon. So anyway, I read it. Needless to say, I don't agree with it. But I reached out to, I don't know if his name is pronounced Omer or Omar. I will find out from him. Let's call him Omer. That's how it's spelled. I reached out to him on Twitter, and he agreed to come on the podcast. And so I anticipate that being a difficult conversation. And my interest is, as I've said before, in trying to figure out how to have hard conversations, how to start very far apart in a conversation and figure out how to converge, or at the very least, agree to disagree on specific points in a way that is not entangled with personal hostility and misunderstanding. And that, admittedly, is a challenge that not everyone is up to. And so it's, I tried it with Noam Chomsky, and I'll be trying it with other people. My conversation with Majid was also an example of that, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out, and it became hugely productive. So I'm going to be running similar psychological and conversational experiments on my podcast. And Omer will be one. Also, I'll be speaking with Jonathan Haidt, who many of you know. He's a very influential psychologist with whom I've disagreed in the past, and in a none too friendly way, I might add. And so that is another instance of my reaching out to somebody who has taken some very hard shots at me in the past, and I've returned fire, and we're going to see if we can have a civil and useful conversation on important topics. That'll be coming sometime in February, I think. And also I will have Steve Pinker on at some point, and I have a few other guests lined up. So there will be interesting conversations coming your way. I feel the need to apologize once again for the level of congestion I'm bringing to the mic now. I have two young girls, each of whom seems to be striving to win the Patient Zero Award for bringing new colds into the world. I don't know if they're out there playing with ducks in a pond or where they're getting these viruses, but they're bringing them to Daddy. So I bring them to you in a substandard audio performance. So bear with me there. So many of you noticed various Twitter controversies and wanted me to address them. Here's the first, with Fareed Zakaria, the CNN and Washington Post journalist. He sent out a tweet about a week ago endorsing a truly terrible piece of Islamist propaganda. And so the tweet read, "My book of the week, Who Speaks for Islam? What a Billion Muslims Really Think." That's the title of the book. And then he calls it An Essential Voice of Reason. Now, this book was written by John Esposito and Dalia Mogahed. And apologies again, I don't know exactly how to pronounce Dalia's last name. I will say Mogahed. It's probably not right. Esposito runs a Middle East Studies Center at Georgetown, and Mogahed works for Gallup, the famous polling organization that published this book that Zakaria was recommending. So I tweeted in response, "Witness the capture of academia, Esposito, polling, Gallup, and journalism, Zakaria, by rank Islamism." Now, many people took this tweet to be a sign that I had gone off the deep end by alleging some kind of stealth Islamist takeover of our institutions. Well, there is an attempted Islamist takeover of our institutions, and it's not especially stealthy. But to be clear, I wasn't claiming that Zakaria is an Islamist. Rather, I think he's probably been deceived by Islamist misinformation, of which there's an endless supply. And there is no question he's spreading such misinformation by pushing this book. And nor do I think Esposito is an Islamist, because to my knowledge he's not even a Muslim. But everything I've seen him publish about Islam has been, if not a lie, a half-truth. He's someone who I've called a Muslim apologist in the past, and his center at Georgetown is funded with tens of millions of dollars by the Saudi government. It's the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, and its function appears to be to whitewash Islam in general and the obscenity of Saudi Wahhabi Islam in particular. Now, I was frankly unfamiliar with Mogahed. She's the executive director of the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies. I just happened to have seen her on Meet the Press a few days before, sitting beside my friend Azra Nomani, the eminently rational journalist and Muslim reformer. And more or less every word out of Mogahed's mouth was, again, a lie or a half-truth that seemed calculated to deceive a secular audience. She was saying things like the members of ISIS aren't religious, and that they have no theological or popular support, and that there's no correlation between being a religious Muslim and being a jihadist. In fact, the correlation is negative, according to Mogahed. You're more likely to be a jihadist if you're not a devout Muslim. These statements are completely dishonest. I did a little digging on Mogahed, and from what I can tell, it seems that she has some affinity for, if not direct connection to, the Muslim Brotherhood, as do many people who claim to be Muslim moderates in our society. And it's very annoying that only people on the political right, and many of whom are dogmatic Christians or Jews, seem to have the time or the temperament to point this out. Okay, a group like the Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, which seems to be the most influential Muslim civil rights organization, was a direct offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood and has been supportive of terrorist organizations like Hamas. Okay, now, is it connected with these organizations now? I don't know. Do its members even know? It could be like Scientology, where you don't know how crazy the organization is until you're deep in it. But I can tell you one thing for certain. This is an organization that systematically lies about Islam and demonizes its critics, and tries to make life as difficult as possible for people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And again, this group is treated like the Muslim ACLU by the press. It's insane. And both Esposito and Mogahed are darlings of this organization, as is Glenn Greenwald, as you know. So whatever her connections, Mogahed practices some of the worst forms of Islamist obscurantism and identity politics. She describes jihadism as a purely political phenomenon that has no connection to religious doctrine or belief. And needless to say, it's always arising out of that vast reservoir of, quote, legitimate grievances that Muslims have against the West. And she's also an Obama appointee. She sits on the President's Advisory Council on faith-based and neighborhood partnerships. And she's one of the people who had a hand in writing President Obama's famous Cairo speech. Again, I'm painfully aware that despairing over facts like these makes one sound like a right-wing crackpot. So to be clear, I am an Obama supporter. I voted for him both times. I will almost certainly vote for Hillary Clinton in the fall, because I don't see any other conceivable choice, though I have to hold my nose over her obscurantism on this issue in particular. But it isn't crazy to worry that Islamists are gaming our system, because they quite obviously are. Now, again, I don't know for sure whether Mogahed is an Islamist. Okay, she wears the hijab and says some very dishonest things about Islam in general and Sharia law in particular. Still, she may just be a useful idiot like her colleague John Esposito. Okay, the line here can be difficult to find, and it may not even be important to find it. It's the ideas and their influence, rather than the people conveying the ideas, that I'm worried about. This is also not to say that ideologically motivated people, even Islamists, couldn't produce an honest poll or a book based on such